It's time for a special interview. So this tragedy that occurred in Itaewon is, of course, on the minds of every person here in Korea. And it's also become international news, unfortunately. The fact that so many people lost their lives due to this accident. So let's find out more as we are, of course, going through a grieving process. But also, we need to know better information in terms of safe crowd management. We have invited Gil Freed, who is a professor and chair of the Administration and Law Department at the University of West Florida. Let's welcome him back to the program. Hi, Professor. Are you there?
I am here. Thank you for having me, and I wish I was here in better circumstances.
Absolutely. Thank you for your thoughts on that. So first, in terms of the vocabulary that's been popping up. First, many reports here in Korea use terms like stampede, and then there are other terms like crowd surge or crowd crush. So can you go over the definitions and the differences?
Sure. There is a significant difference between the various terms. A crowd surge is normally considered a sudden movement where people are moved in one direction or another. And it could be because of pressure from the back. It could be from people falling over. But it's a sudden, unexpected kind of movement. A crowd crush could be sudden, but it could also be sustained, which means it could have been going on for a while. And then it just so happens that people get injured at a certain time. With a crowd crush, you don't necessarily have injuries. So you have, for example, people on a street corner in a busy metropolitan area, such as Seoul, who might be waiting to cross the street and they're very close to each other. That could be a crowd crush because people are right next to each other, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to lead to injury. A stampede, on the other hand, is a longer distance where you have people that are moving forward at a faster pace than what might be a slow prodding movement that you might have, for example, with a crowd crush or a crowd surge. But you can have fast movement with those as well. So it all depends upon the circumstances, what's going on. But they are different terms and there's different factors that lead to each one.
So in your opinion, because, which term do you think is the most appropriate to use in this situation?
I think at the present time, based upon what we know, it's probably going to be considered more of a crowd crush. And we're going to figure that out. There's two ways people unfortunately pass away in a crowd incident. It's either asphyxiation, where they can't breathe, or a crushing, where their body is crushed based upon being pushed against other objects or other people. We don't have the details yet, and the autopsies will possibly provide that kind of detail if there are any autopsies. But it looks like at this point, because as you previously said at the start of the segment, that there were warning calls at 6:30 that evening, so 3.5 hours in advance, that means it's a more sustained thing. That's why I think it's more of a crowd crush.
All right. In terms of the particulars, if we look at, the video footage, and if we look at the overhead kind of mapping of, the area of where this incident happened, what do you think were some of the factors, the aspects of Itaewon that contributed to this catastrophe?
I think the first and foremost one is the narrow alleyway. I mean, whenever you have a narrow funnel, you have what's called a pinch point. And the pinch point, think of it, the best way to think about it, is like a funnel. And so if you're at the top of the stuff that's being poured in, you're not moving around a lot, and you're probably not going to be crushed. But it's those that are at the bottom, at the base of the funnel, where all the pressure is on them. And when all the pressure is on them, that's going to be a problem. So whenever you have anything that's narrow, anything that's downhill, you have to take that in consideration, that makes it more difficult. And you have to open things up, spread things wider. So we take into consideration the locale, but we also examine the weather, lighting, noise level, whether there's any barricades, where security personnel are located, where you might have directional signage, things like that all go into what we take a look at when we're preparing for an event. And then after a tragedy like this, when we look at see what went wrong. Mm-hmm. And first and foremost, you should not have 100,000 people or more in this area. That's just from a planning perspective, that's a major failure. Yes. It's not equipped for it.
And so, the fact is, to me, it's not an excuse at all. The fact that there was no official organizer or host of the Halloween festivities. But in terms of just as a layperson, if you're in a situation where it definitely feels very, very crowded and, over 100,000 people plus in a very small area. What are some things or precautions that we should be taking? Things we should keep in mind when we do visit crowded places like this?
The first thing you have to be aware of is what we call situational awareness. You have to look at the surrounding. If you're in an area and you're about to enter an area and you see that it's pretty crowded, you're hearing a lot of noises, a lot of different things going on in commotion, maybe the best thing is just to hold back. Maybe enter in, as some people did, into one of the storefronts or bars. Avoid the congestion. Congested areas are difficult to begin with, so you want to protect yourself and be aware of the situation. You also want to know where any potential exits are. We had a major fire in America back in 2003 called the Station Nightclub Fire, where over 100 people passed away in Rhode Island. And some people were just feet away from an exit, but they were trying to go back to where they had come in because they didn't realize there was an exit near them. Situational awareness, when you go into an area, see where all the potential exits are, see where there are potential issues or concerns, and then try to avoid those areas. When you have general assembly seating, which is where people can go wherever they want, they're not assigned a given seat. Mm-hmm. That's what we have here, where people go wherever they want. You don't want to be in the front. First and foremost, you want to avoid that area altogether because that is where all the problems normally occur. Now, you can't have issues elsewhere, but normally when you're in the front, that's where you can't back out. You can't go forward. You're stuck. And there's going to be issues with dehydration, people passing out. That's why we tell people if you're going to be in the front, always have water with you and always try to get the attention of security personnel that you can tell them, look at, if something goes wrong, can you pull me out?
Mm-mm. And so, let's say, for example, Professor, that, unfortunately you're in a situation where it is very much crowded, and, you feel uncomfortable. What should we do?
One thing I encourage people to do is to go in groups. Uh-huh. If you have other people, it's great to have numbers.
Yes.
It gives you safety in numbers, but it's also another set of eyes and ears that can help you out. If you have an issue and you're separated, don't try going back to find people. Try to have a rendezvous spot where you say, if anything happens and we get separated, let's meet at X or Y street lamp or street corner or something else like that. It's like a burning building. You don't want to go back in if you can avoid it. If you fall down, what we encourage people to do is to crawl out. Don't try to stand up again. Crawl out. Go to the sides if at all possible. If you have time, we recommend what's called the boxer stance, where you try to brace your legs and not have them together, but spread out apart to give yourself some room and some stability. Also, some people try to make their chest bigger and try to create some room between them. But that's hard to do because can you do that for maybe an hour, like some of the witnesses have testified to, that they were there for a long time in a cramped position, and you can't hold that pose for that long.
Right. And so speaking of all those, the stance and the physical aspects of this. So, I mean, to me as a layperson, it's no surprise that the majority of the victims were female, meaning, smaller in stature overall, generally speaking, maybe not able to kind of hold their ground as they were being crushed, right?
That could be it. Also, we have to take a look at whether or not people were drinking beforehand, and that can impact their ability to have balance. And so if they've been drinking for an hour or two and have blood alcohol content that's above the acceptable limit, that could affect their ability to walk straight, stand up straight, things like that. But you are correct that women in these kind of situations often fare worse than men, just because their bodies are smaller, and it doesn't take a lot of pressure to have asphyxiation and also to have crushed bodies. We've had instances where people have, with their bodies, manipulated railings at stadiums and arenas that require over 1,000 pounds of pressure per square inch to budge, and they were twisted like pieces of string. Mm-hmm. And so there's a lot of pressure when you have 5 or 6 people deep or more pushing against people in the front, and women can unfortunately suffer more harm.
Yes. And I do want to ask also, Professor, before it gets unbearably uncomfortable or to the point where you feel like you are getting crushed, for example, like for me, like to me, you know, personal space is like so important. So if I feel like someone is getting a little too close for comfort, even in our culture where we don't want to offend others, isn't it better just to say, hey, get out of my personal space, move away? Before, of course, it becomes so crowded.
A lot of that depends upon the person and their personality. But if this comes to a life or death situation, I'd rather be rude than to suffer or have somebody else suffer. So if people are pushing, it's all right to go back and say, hey, look at, you know what? This is not safe. What you're doing is going to put me and other people in harm's way. Please back up. Now, that might be difficult if they're being pushed towards you. Yes. So I actually handled a case a number of years ago with Eminem, the rapper. Mm-hmm. And what he did is he noticed that there was a problem up front. So he started a dance with the people in the back saying, everyone take 2 steps backward, 1 step forward, 2 steps backward, 1 step forward. And he was encouraging them to back up. But he also said, guys, besides this being a dance, there are people who are hurt here. And so I need you to do this in order to back up and to give us space so we could bring ambulances here. And so that's where, if you have people in authority in the right position with the right tools, they could do that. So you could have people that are security officers or crowd managers who can be on loudspeakers and tell people, look, there is a concern. But you have to have the people there that are trained, know what they're doing, and have the right tools. If they're not there and they don't have the training or the tools, they're very ineffective. And I think that is probably one of the biggest issues that you're going to be examining with your investigation going on.
Right. So for a wrap-up question, I mean, I know it's very early on in the investigation and it's too maybe early to point fingers, but in terms of crowd management, I mean, I'm sure that even if it's not hosted by an entity or by a city government or anything like that, shouldn't there still be public, protection and protocols in terms of controlling crowds?
Oh, definitely. And I don't buy the argument, that, it wasn't officially sanctioned or anything else like this. They've known this has been going on for years. So the local government could have mandated that people buy permits, and that as part of the permitting process, they put in place a security plan. The biggest issue in these kind of cases is you have to have a plan and follow it. Now, one thing that I know of, at least for a fact at the present time, is that the local police were hoping to get, if possible, up to 200 people as police officers to provide protection. That is woefully inadequate. And I'm using that term very a lawyer. That's woefully inadequate. If you anticipate 100,000 people at an event, and I've heard that there could have been at least 150,000 because 130,000 people took the metro over there. So you also have, let's say, maybe 20,000 who took buses and cars and walked there. Under the National Fire Protection Association in the United States, but there's also a green guide and an orange guide in England. Mm-hmm. So it's an international standard. You need 1 trained crowd manager for every 250 people in attendance. If you base that on 100,000 people, that would have been 400 trained security personnel. Police aren't necessarily trained in crowd management. They might be trained in crowd control, but that's different than crowd management. If we had 150,000 people, you would have needed 600 crowd managers there. And if they had about 170, that's That's why I say it's woefully inadequate. That's why you need to do the preparation in advance and get the right people with the right skills, right training, in the right position, in the right numbers, with the right tools. Because if they do not have communication devices, closed-circuit television that they can monitor on an ongoing basis, then this is just a repetition of what has happened many times in England and in other countries all over the world. We know this is going to happen if you don't take precautions.
Yes.
And this is unfortunately something that could have been prevented. And it's easy to prevent it.
Well, thank you so much for answering some of the tough questions today. We do appreciate your expertise, Professor.
My pleasure, and I send condolences and blessings and good thoughts and prayers to everyone and their families. May we only have safe times in our future.
Thank you so much once again. This was our special interview with Professor Gil Freed.